Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino, and I'm here today with Diana Giovinazzo, and we're going to talk about her latest book, Antoinette's Sister. Again, I thought this was going to be another chick book, but it was really a great book. So,
I kind of have this tendency to kind of walk this fine line between chick books and not so chick books.
yeah, and I say that half jokingly because I want to make sure that the men read this book because it's very, very interesting. So, the first thing, when you talked about Antoinette's sister, I had no idea that Antoinette's sister was Maria Carolina, the Queen of Naples.
Yeah.
So,
It,
so what got you started with this book and picking her as a subject?
you know, it started because when I was working on The Woman in Red, my editor asked for more information about the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and I was like, sure, I'm gonna go ahead and do some research, and I did what any good writer does and become an expert overnight. And within 24 hours, I was getting all these stories about Ferdinand, which, when you read the book, all of those antics that he did, from pulling wigs off of people. I'm sorry, my dog, she
That's
wanted to come
okay.
in my lab.
That's fine.
She wants to be a part of the show. Um, all of the antics, from the pulling the wigs off of people's heads, the hot buttered spaghetti on top of their wigs, playing chess with the old men. That was all a part of everything he did, all of it. And I thought, oh my God, who's the poor woman who was stuck with him? Somebody had to have been married to him. Somebody had to put up with these antics. And I really feel bad for her. And so I did some more research and I came across Maria Carolina Charlotte and the story of what she had to go through just to take power in Naples, to be able to she had to control him, because really, let's face it, wasn't really able to rule the kingdom, and become one of three women who actually stood up to Napoleon.
Mm.
And that's what brought me to her, and finding this family that she was a part of. And it's sad because when it comes to her and Marie Antoinette, they were so close, and she's forgotten about. They were raised as twins when they were young. They are 3 years apart, but the two women looked so much alike that after Marie Antoinette's death, when people came from France over to the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, there was a woman who actually fainted upon seeing Maria Carolina Charlotte because they looked so much alike. And the sisters were very, very close. And it is true that Maria Carolina was Marie Antoinette's most favorite sister. And when I say most favorite sister, there were 16 children that Maria
Wow.
Theresa had. So there were quite a few sisters, but Maria Carolina was a favorite.
And she had a lot of children too.
She did. She could not be outdone by her mother, and she had 17.
I, I guess if you have the servants and the nannies and all that, it's not so
Exactly,
bad.
exactly. I don't even have one yet. I'm like, my God.
So anybody who's watching, I'm sitting in the Caserta Palace right now behind me. I forget which room it is, but
It looks kind of like the throne room.
it could be. Yeah, it probably is. Yeah,
I think that's
yeah.
the throne room.
So now, as I'm reading this book,
Mm-hmm.
I started. Then I said I have to research the sisters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as it turns out, they are my eighth cousins, eight times removed.
Really?
Yeah. So I didn't go back to Ferdinand. I know I'm definitely related to Ferdinand too, and probably the Empress also. Because Ferdinand, I know he comes from the Spanish royalty, and my great grandmother's family comes from Spanish royalty. Um, so I said I have to figure I have to see if I'm related to them somehow, and as it turns out, we're eighth cousins, eight times removed, uh, and as you're describing the palace and the nobles in Italy, um, I'm thinking to myself, well, some of my great grandparents were probably there at these
Mm-hmm.
functions,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
they were, one was there were princes and there were dukes and counts and all of that. But what I found funny was, I guess Ferdinand, I guess he handed out princes and princesses at will.
And the thing that I found with researching him is that this idea of royalty just was lost on him. He was very much a man of the common people.
Yeah.
And that's something that I really wanted to portray, was that he loved Italy. He loved Naples. He wouldn't speak anything but dialect. He refused to even, like, there's the proper Italian that we commonly speak today, and then there's the dialect, which is, Neapolitan is its own language. And he didn't, he only spoke that dialect. He only spoke Neapolitan language. So when you have instances where you have, the French ambassadors coming in and they don't speak anything but French, he can't understand them.
Yeah, and I know that there was one point where he said, "Why should I speak anything else? This is the right language."
Exactly.
But I love the story that I guess he was part brat, but also to your point about connecting with the people, I just found it fascinating that someone of his stature, and I guess maybe because he wasn't considered to be that he was going to be the king of Spain, and he got this lesser kingdom, that to your point, he didn't connect with the royalty as much, but he had these games where he'd go into town and play the fishmonger.
Yeah. Fishmonger, innkeeper, he had a farm, he liked to play farmer, all of those things, those were his games. He loved that. And one of the interesting things for him, for those of you listening who aren't as familiar, there's King Carlos, who was the king of the Two Sicilies. And then when his brother dies without children, Carlos goes to Spain, becomes a Spanish king, and Carlos had 3 sons. So there was Philip, who was the oldest, and unfortunately there was something wrong with him. They don't specifically say what it was. The way they classified the the mental illness, or like the physical illness of that sort of stature, they would call him an imbecile. It was what it was. So there was something actually inherently wrong with Philip. He was physically not capable of being a ruler. So then they came to the next 2 sons. So there was Carlos, another Carlos, which I don't know if it was like Carlos II, Carlos III, what have you. They were all, that was one of the problems with this book, everybody all had the same names. So then there was his son Carlos, who ended up going to Spain, and then there was Ferdinand. And instead of actually taking into consideration that, they didn't really have genetic studies at the time, they didn't really understand these things that we now consider today to be, illnesses, illnesses, and they didn't have any kind of compassion really for him either. And so what Carlos's thought was, okay, I've got these other 2 sons, I want them to be proper rulers, so I'm going to make sure they go out and they hunt, they do physical activities, whether it's hunting, what have you. They're going to be outside all the time, constant physical activity, and that's going to ward away any kind of physical malady or mental malady. And with Tanucci, he really took it to heart and took advantage of that. Yeah. Where he was like, okay, we're going to send him outside just all the time. Just go play. Just go outside and play. I'll take care of all of this. So you have this king who really was stunted in his emotional growth. And you had, Tanucci just taking advantage of that. And so when time came for him to actually rule, he couldn't. And my thought is that if Ferdinand had the tools that, say, Maria Carolina, or even more like, somebody else like in England or France had to rule a country, I think he would have been a very good king. Well, maybe not very good, but he would be a good king.
Yeah. And I the other thing that was Very well. I mean, she was obviously a very powerful woman. But the other
Mhm.
interesting thing that I never knew was that she was actually destined to be Queen of France.
Mhm. Yeah, that she was earmarked for that. And I say earmarked because Maria Theresa liked to place all her
Hmm.
children in very, important roles. And there were two sisters ahead of her that were supposed to be the queens of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies.
That's right.
Two,
Yeah.
and they both died. Sorry, spoilers. But it's what it was this really weird happenstance when I was reading it, and when I was doing research, it was kind of creepy in a way, or interesting. There
Yeah.
are these chat rooms that talk about the possibility of actual like alternative history, and they were actually wondering what would have happened if Maria Carolina was the Queen of France instead of Marie Antoinette.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
it's just such a fascinating question for us to ask ourselves, and what it would have been like. I honestly don't think the revolution would have been as intense as it was. I think Maria Carolina would probably have headed it off at the start of it, and at the very least, she would have gotten away, regardless of what she would have taken her children and left. Just something
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
surprised me that Marie Antoinette, she had so many opportunities to leave and she didn't.
Yeah. And it's funny too because you often think about people say, well, if I was there in that time,
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's you don't know that.
Yeah.
you know you don't know if you were well, if I was nobility or if I was a slave owner, if I was you don't know because history is history. You were in a place and time 400 years ago. You wouldn't have thought like you thought today
Mm-hmm.
or think
You're a
today.
product of your environment.
Exactly.
The
Yeah.
nature versus nurture, and nurture really plays a heavy hand in the way we think, especially in a larger society.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah. Now the other thing that I learned was I knew about the Habsburgs in Italy, but I didn't realize that they were so ingrained in all of Italy at the time, even though they were all separate, you know, uh, countries, for lack of a better word.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they were, to your point, Maria Theresa. She had her children everywhere.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Italy, where she called them her Italian colonies.
Yeah.
She actually referred to them as that because there was in Parma there was Amalia. In Milan that was it France or Carl? I called him Carl in the book because his name was Carl Ferdinand. So because I couldn't, yet again, another one of those situations where you have same names. I called him Carl in the book because of that. And then you have Leopold in Tuscany,
Yeah.
and then you have Maria Carolina in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies.
Yeah, yeah, no, well, extremely powerful family without question. Um, so you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
and that she, unlike some of the men at the
Mm-hmm.
time, stood up to Napoleon
Yeah.
and France and France too, even
Yeah.
before
She really.
Napoleon.
It was interesting, going through this research and connecting the dots of everything and seeing when you're looking at a book from one, person's point of view, historical point of view, you see things a little differently. And looking at it from this Italian point of view, this whole liberty, equality, fraternity that they're espousing in France, when they were coming into Italy, it really was like a matter of anarchy. They were spreading this anarchy within the country. One of they're just looting everything that they could get their hands on, they would loot. And Napoleon was no better, where he would, when he saw the soldiers with all their loot, he would pick through and pick out the stuff that
Yeah,
he wanted. And so they were taking a lot, and they were using this to fund their war machine. And they really, their eyes were always, in my opinion, always on the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, because the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was so prosperous. And I say so prosperous because they had all this art, they had all this gold, they had, this year's worth of, decades really of work, maybe even centuries to some extent. And they wanted that. They wanted to get in there and get all of that. And so really it was expansionist philosophy that he had.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that people don't understand, because people think of the South post 1860, when they were decimated by Piedmont in the North. They don't realize how powerful the South was prior to the unification.
Absolutely. And she was raising taxes because they had this small army, and they were a multicultural society. There were a lot of people coming in, historically, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, they were multicultural. You have, when you go into Sicily and you see all the architecture from the Middle East. And so you had North Africans, you had Middle East, you had people from the Normans that came in, and then the Habsburgs coming in, and the Italians that were there. So it was this really great multicultural society that was happening. And she had universities, they had hospitals, so much that they were doing to take care of themselves throughout all of these changing hands, because they were Habsburgs for a while, under the Habsburg rule, and then they were under the Spanish rule, then they were under their own rule. And so even though they were going back and forth, they were really much within their own, territory. They were this prosperous city, and to the point where I've gone to book events and people haven't even heard of it as a kingdom in and of itself.
Yeah. Well, and that's what frustrates me so much, and especially in doing my research, is that we know about the French nobility and royalty, we know about the English, we know about the Spanish, we know about the Portugal. No, there's very, very little written about the Italian nobles, the system, all of these little kingdoms, and how they changed hands. And especially, I think more than anything else, is all these intermarriages. Yeah. Within Italy, because again, within my family, I see the marriages to this mostly to Spanish, but there is the Austrian, and there is the early on the French, because, and what I read, one thing I did read was that when the Spanish came, there just wasn't enough Spanish nobility after a while to marry. So they had to marry the Italian. They had to marry the Italians. They had no choice. So one other interesting thing, again, I didn't know about Maria Carolina and standing up to Napoleon and all of that. My fourth great grandmother was the Duchess of Capricota, Marie Angela Theresa. Her husband was, I think her husband was Carlo Capici-Piccicelli, but she wound up being exiled from Capricota. I assume that that was her town, but obviously they lived in Naples. But she died in Paris in 1815, and I can't figure out. So for some reason, I've seen that Napoleon, for whatever reason, sent her to Paris, but I can't figure out why. And she wound up dying in Paris, and eventually, of course, her daughter, or her son, and then later her daughter, because the brother died, took over Capricota. But there's just not enough history written about it to piece together why she was sent to Paris.
Interesting. I know my historical fiction mind is all sorts of turning, like, who did she piss off to get her exiled? Yeah, she had to have done something, and maybe she was a woman who stood up to him. Because when they came into the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, him and Jean Murat or Jacques Murat, whatever, Murat, the terrible guy that he was doing a lot of stuff that was not good, and he was causing a lot of problems and killing a lot of Italians. for it. So he was a very brutal man. And so there was something about that that was after definitely after Maria Carolina died. So it was around the time that her son Ferdinand was technically in power. Um, and that would have been her son Francis, who, even though he was a regent, he took over his mother's job of handling the kingdom and letting his father be the figurehead.
Mm-hmm.
So there was probably during, because there was the times that they were still, having problems with France and southern Italy at the time too. So maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are records showing that that's where she died. So I know
Mm-hmm.
that, and I know that she died without money. But then, like I said, at some point her son was able to take over the town again and regain the noble titles and all of that. So why do you think? Um, Let me ask the question a different way. Do you think what stifled, or at least put off, getting rid of the nobility in Italy, was because Napoleon was eventually, defeated, or was it just that the will of the people at that point in time, they weren't into that, doing away with the monarchy or the nobility and all of that?
I don't think they were quite. And it's a really complicated thing because they had the Carthaginian Republic, which I didn't really get into in the book because I wanted to focus in primarily on Maria Carolina and when she was the most effective. And during that time of the Republic, she really wasn't all that effective for the country. And so, they had that, and then her son Francis leads the Bourbon forces into there. There's some Calabrese that are involved in rising up to protect the monarchy, which I'm Calabrian, so of course I'm going to be all about that because I feel like we always get the short end of the stick. Everybody's making fun of us, but we help the monarchy. And I would love to think of the possibility that some of my family was involved in that. And so they come in and then they get kicked back out and then they come back in again. So there's that back and forth. And I kind of feel like once they got in there, they just really, as the nobility, just really entrenched themselves. The book, The Leopard, I believe it is. Yeah. I think that really does a really good job of getting into why the nobility was the way it was. And Garibaldi, I know saying Garibaldi is basically a swear word when you talk about the South, but it's interesting. I was reading a book and doing some research on something else once, and he came up, as he always does, and he really wanted to have that what was the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies to be a free society, as what they call it, republic. And he really, and his ideas were really progressive for the time, where he wanted to have this for the rule. It was a matter of equaling out everything for everybody, which meant that the nobility would not be able to get all their wealth. It would be spread amongst the people. It was very almost socialist in its nature, the way he was talking. And that was one of the things that led them to talk bad about him, get that whole negative propaganda. And when they went to the unification, they kind of let those other things, what happened with unification, which was basically all that industry, all the stuff that was prosperous about the Two Sicilies got moved up north. And they let that happen because they were able to keep their wealth. So it was the 1% going, okay, we're going to keep our wealth, screw the little guy. It was that kind of mentality that they had. And after unification, Garibaldi said, when it comes to the north, they did what the Bourbons tried for centuries to do, which was destroy the Two Sicilies.
Yeah, that's sad. And I was amazed to find out that the nobles in Naples didn't pay taxes.
No,
The people paid taxes, but they didn't pay
and that was
taxes.
kind of common. That was kind of a common
Yeah,
thing. That's what
yeah,
got France into trouble. That they weren't the
yeah.
French nobility. They were hoarding all this wealth, and they weren't paying taxes. And so you have all this famine and all this strife going on in France, and because they wouldn't pay taxes, you had the French Revolution. I don't want to get political, but that it's almost kind of telling when you're looking at American society, which we could keep it at that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't think it's just American society. But yeah,
I agree.
It's funny because I keep finding out all this stuff, and my wife keeps saying, "So where's ours?" And I said, well, "I think I'm way, way, way too far removed from that." But one thing that's funny is one of my fourth cousins, Januaria Piramalo, she's the second season of The Real Housewives of Naples. She's on it.
Oh wow!
And I can't find it anyplace. I'm sure I have to find. I'm sure it's on some Italian TV station here someplace, but I haven't been able to find it yet.
Just the fact that they have a Real Housewives of Naples, I want to find it. I mean, I kind of have a little reality show habit sometimes when you just need something in the background so you can focus on your writing. Sometimes I like to have some reality shows on the background. So I need to find that, and that would be fun to especially for somebody like me who's studying Italian, to have that, to be able to.
And it was so funny because I tell people, I said, I don't know anybody in America with all these Real Housewives. I don't know anybody here, but in Italy.
In Italy, you've got one. You've got a family member.
I have a family member. And she's I guess she gets to call herself Marchesa because she's from the direct line, unlike me. And she lives in Naples and Milan, I believe, and she's a fashionista and very vocal. I've seen some YouTubes of her, and she's very out there, very boisterous type of personality. So that's probably why they had her on the show, I guess. So I don't know. I'm supposed to meet. Oh God, we're finally going to get there in June, I think. And I'm supposed to meet a whole bunch of cousins that I never knew existed. So,
oh, wonderful!
I keep my fingers crossed that maybe she'll be there.
Fingers crossed.
But I did just recently find a second cousin.
Oh, wonderful!
From my grandmother's family that I never knew. So that was very exciting indeed to find that. So what's next? What are you going to work on next?
I can't share. Unfortunately, I have to keep it a secret still. There is a book. I can say that much. It's with my publisher right now. We'll see. I got a couple other things in the works, but unfortunately, I can't share. Sorry. For those of you listening and watching, if you're interested, just hang out, subscribe to my newsletter, and I will share the news once I can.
I wish I had the talent that you have to go back and write about my Caracciolo ancestors, because they go back to 950 in Naples. I mean, I have my grandmother back to 950.
You never know until you try.
I have to get a lot more creative, but I'll see what happens with this book that I did now and see if anybody actually wants to read it. I tell my stories of my growing up and then how I did my research and how I found certain things. So we'll see. So to your point, where can people find the newsletter? Where can people find the book?
DianaGiovinazzo.com, and that's got links all over it. It's also got the newsletter there. Antoinette's sister, the lovely cover right here, and it's much shinier in person, I have to say. I love the cover. It's available anywhere you get books.
And again, it was for anybody who's interested in the history of whether it's the Habsburgs, the French Revolution, Naples. It's all in there, and it's put in such a way that it's a great read. And again, Ferdinand, he's such a fun character.
I had so much fun writing him. He was fun. He was so entertaining to write. I mean, at first you get this first like, oh my God, who is this person? I think my editor said it best herself, where she was just like, when I first read him, I hated him, absolutely hated him. She's like, by the end of the book, I was just so happy whenever he would make an appearance on the page.
Yeah, that's true. And I was thinking the same thing. He kind of grows on you, and you know, he grew on her also.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Absolutely.
she didn't really wasn't into it at first.
I don't blame her.
But I guess if you have 17 kids, there's got to be some connections there.
There's got to be.
Well, thanks again. This has been really, really great. I mean, the first book was great. This book is great, and we'll look forward to the third book.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And thank you for having me back on.
Oh, so we'll have you back when the next book comes out.
Oh, I'd love that. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.